Rialto.
Thank you, sir. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to make some remarks on the Joint Committee into the establishment of Adelaide University. This has been a lengthy process in terms of the time taken, and from the opposition's point of view, the modest resources that we have available certainly have been applied very heavily over the last 4 or 5 months as this matter has been considered. And so with that in mind, I'd like to particularly thank the Honourable Jing Lee, MLC, who has worked with me from the Liberal Party's point of view. We have a very modest staff team in terms of the resources available to us, but I note Samuel Morrison, who was in the Leader of the Opposition's office and applied himself significantly to the role, along with Ryan Smith, Elise Baker, Ben Harvey, Lachlan Skinner from my own office, and indeed other staff members who have provided us support where possible. In working through this matter, of course, the committee was ably assisted by staff including David Pegram. David, not for the longest of terms, but certainly seeing us through that first meeting and ensuring that the committee understood what it was doing to start with, until his role was taken by Alison Meeks as Joint Secretary, and Shane Hilton, who worked with us throughout. Tonya Coulter, Tonya Coulter provided that secretariat. Research officer support from Alistair Taylor and Megan Fink when Alistair took on a different role. Their work was important throughout and enabled the committee to function, I think, very well. And I also recognise the other members of the committee, the member for Adelaide, the member for Gibson, the member for Florey, the Speaker from the House of Assembly, and from the Legislative Council, the Honourable Reggie Martin, the Honourable Jing Lee I've mentioned, the Honourable Robert Sims, the Honourable Connie Benares, and the Honourable Sarah Game. 10 members is a large committee, and we spent a lot of time together over the course of our witness hearings and our deliberative meetings. There was, I think, an opportunity for improvements that could have been done to this process had the committee had more time to reflect, had the committee had slightly different terms of reference, as suggested by the Liberal Party and the Honourable Frank Pangello and the Honourable Rob Sims and Tammy Franks prior to the formation of the committee. But within the frame of the terms of reference we had, and within the frame of the time frame that we had, I thank the other members of the committee for the collegiate way in which, for the most part, we conducted our business, and for the most part worked pretty well together. I was a co-author of a minority report suggesting that I didn't agree with everything that the majority of the members of the committee signed up to. The Honourable Robert Sims and the Honourable Jing Lee joined me in co-authoring our minority report. I encourage members to turn their attention to it. I'll draw some particular attention to some aspects during this contribution. And I note the Honourable Robert Sims also identified himself as not being with the majority. The Speaker was in the chair, and there were 6 other members of the committee who certainly there was a majority view that is reflected in some of the findings and the recommendations. That said, I agreed with a lot of the findings and the recommendations. The minority report highlights some difference in nuance on some of them. The majority report highlights some areas that should have been strengthened in our view, and the majority report identifies support for a number of the recommendations as well. I'm just going to start with the genesis of how we got here. The Labor Party, one of its first election commitments was for the future, a South Australian University merger. I just want to remind people of where we've come from. The document with the Premier's face on the front says that the harsh truth is that each of our universities alone are too small and too undercapitalised to make it into the list of top international universities. They simply don't do large enough scale research to be recognised as world leading, and that is holding our stake back. Combined, our 3 universities don't equal the revenue of the University of Melbourne alone. I take issue with some of that, frankly. The universities we have in South Australia are all within the top 3% of university rankings within the world. The University of Adelaide is within the top 1%. The University of Flinders is just outside that mark. The University of Adelaide is the 8th highest ranked university in Australia and indeed is a destination of choice for thousands and thousands of university students. It's ranked in the top 100 according to 2 of the measures last year and 1 of the measures this year, and is a very highly ranked university. There is a risk of that ranking subsiding, as we'll get to in the time coming. But I think that the Premier got that wrong in fact, but nevertheless, we'll continue. The other point I would make is, of course, that rankings aren't based on scale of research, as this document suggests. Rankings are based on a number of things, but most of them that have a research aspect, that's very strong, but it tends to be on the top quality research that we're talking about, not just the volume of research. The volume of top quality research is the key thing. The document goes on saying the Labor and Government will establish a University Merger Commission to chart a path, full stop. It will include the leadership of the 3 universities and be headed up by an eminent commissioner with higher education experience. Its task will be to determine how the state can be best served by the university sector. Now, methodology aside, it's a worthy goal to consider how the state can be best served by the university sector. And I always saw that as being the key function that the committee looking into this matter could serve. How is our state best served? Because, of course, the university councils that provided the heads of agreement signatures to the government in signing up to this, they considered this from the point of view of their institution as defined by their councils, as defined by their legislation. Their institution contributes to the state's interests, but their institution's interests are not necessarily exactly the same as the state's interests. Adelaide University, for example, the University of Adelaide's interests are the well-being of the University of Adelaide, the volume of research, the well-being of staff and students, the success that they have in attracting staff and students, and they contribute to our state's interests. But Adelaide University and the University of South Australia in Flinders are all separate institutions. And indeed, their interests are confined to their own institution, irrespective of the well-being of the other institutions. There are examples where staff and students from within one state have gone to another institution from within one state. This will become quite apparent in my later remarks, particularly in relation to Flinders University. The well-being and the advancement of a new university, or Uni of Adelaide or Uni of South Australia, can only be considered in the state's interests when you take into account Flinders as well. If the outcome of work we do today is to see taxpayers' dollars supporting the new university with detrimental results to Flinders, that's not a net benefit to the state, and it doesn't meet the goal set by the Premier in his election document. The opposition will be here with some suggestions and some recommendations, of course. So anyway, the Premier's promise is for a University Merger Commission. No, I know that hasn't happened. At any rate, the Premier has said that there is a different path. The universities came to this suggestion that the Premier and the government considered, and the Premier and the government decided, in lieu of their election promise, to go down this path instead, rather than having a commission. At any rate, what was the Commission intended to do? Let's have a look at that. The document goes on. Should the Independent Commission determine that a university merger is in the interest of the South Australian economy and the welfare of the people of the state, then a merger will be a first-term priority for a Labor government. And intriguingly, the document then, after that full stop, says a university merger will be a first-time priority for a Labor government. It's unclear whether this is a typo or if we've got 2 separate promises there, but at any rate, it's clear that the sense of this is that the first corollary for determining whether a university merger is a priority for the government must be that the Commission should determine that it is in the interest of the South Australian economy with 2 Cs I note, and the welfare of the people of this state. Those are reasonable considerations. Those are considerations that a University Commission would have determined under this policy had the policy been implemented. And in the absence of this policy being implemented, those are the 2 considerations that Cabinet absolutely had to consider first and foremost before determining to pursue this merger, to bring this legislation. And one of the points I'll be going into in some detail is that I don't believe that the Cabinet did that. I think that Treasurer's Instruction 17 was, if followed, then followed very loosely by this Cabinet. The idea that ministers and Cabinet should have in front of them the full set of information that they're required to which to make a decision. And I just make the point. I'm not going to dwell on it at length more than is necessary. But the Premier and the Deputy Premier have stated publicly on a number of occasions that they neither read nor sought to read the business case for this institution's development. The Department for Industry, Innovation and Skills gave a testimony to a hearing saying that they had not read the business case, they had not provided policy advice to the government, that it was understood that the universities had done that work of policy consideration as to whether this was in the state's interest. But I make the point again, it was not their purpose to find the state's interests, it was their purpose to find their own institution's interests. So we have a deficiency here. The Department of Industry, Innovation and Skills also gave testimony that the Treasury Department was the lead agency. And when the Treasury Department were given the opportunity to bear witness in the inquiry, the Treasury Department said that their job was basically to negotiate a package with the universities such that the universities would be happy to implement this new interpretation of government policy, i.e. that there will be a merger, without having had the Commission first. Put it in really simple terms. The government promised a commission. Let's even put that to one side. The government promised that they would be focused on the interest of the South Australian economy and the welfare of the people of the state. And without having had any policy advice from the Department for Industry, Innovation and Science, which has higher education functions, nor Treasury, which was the lead agency, nobody within government has provided policy advice to the government saying that it is in the interest of the South Australian economy or indeed the welfare of the people of this state. Nobody from government's provided that. There's been no commission that's provided that advice. And indeed the universities who did work on whether it suited their institutions, they haven't been in a position to provide that advice. It's not their job. So the government came with a proposition, a new proposition that was not an election commitment, and signed heads of agreement with the university saying they would do this, despite its significant impact on our state, despite the significant spending of the significant investment of South Australian taxpayers' funds, without having had any policy advice to suggest that it was good. We only had the Premier's word for it, that he felt that it would be a good idea. The policy document, by the way, went on to say the state should not start this process with a view about which universities should merge, nor which universities should teach what degrees. The role of the state government is to determine what our collective interests are as South Australians, and that is where the process should start. If only that had been true. Just read at great length from the policy document, the opening statements, and every part of it the government did not follow through with. Now, the Joint Committee's purpose and importance, I think, is underscored here because the Joint Committee in many ways, did a lot of the policy work and analysis, risk consideration that the government should have done, that a University Merger Commission would have done, that Cabinet should have done and ministers should have done prior to even bringing their work to Cabinet. But the evidence we had was that they didn't do it. We're here to help. The committee members worked at great length with diligence, supported by those staff, to provide that policy work for the people of South Australia that should have been provided by the government. The goals that the Labor Party set out in their election document to achieve, the 5 outcomes any merger must achieve. For South Australia needs an internationally recognised top 100 university in order to ensure the highest quality research is funded in the state to drive economic growth. This would also lead SA to being attractive to the best and brightest students and staff. Now, the value of having a top 100 university, to be clear, is that it is appealing to international students, and some international students, particularly from some markets, are keen absolutely for there to be studying at a top 100 university. There is a premium that can be attached to the price charged to international students in a top 100 university. Adelaide University is able to charge more than the other institutions in this state because they're a top 100 university. We heard evidence that international students will in many cases look at the country that they want to study in, and they will look at the rankings of the universities, and accordingly they will choose based on what they can afford. That is understood. A top 100 university is not necessarily to drive new research. It's more likely to be a function of having achieved that research. Top 100 University is not going to necessarily guarantee that you have the best and brightest students and staff. That's an insult to every student and staff member at Flinders University and the University of South Australia. Indeed, being a top 100 university is not a reflection on the quality of teaching and learning at an institute at all. Some of the world's most appealing, well-regarded and distinguished teaching universities don't focus on research and don't even figure in the rankings at all. At any rate, it is certainly a thing that is useful for South Australia to have in terms of our appeal to the international student market. And as the member for Adelaide said in her contribution before, I think all members of the committee unambiguously agreed with the proposition that international students are good for South Australia, they are good for our economy, they are good for diversity within our institutions, they are good for our students to engage with and learn from. They provide positive impacts in terms of their direct contribution for their fees, their living expenses while they are here, their tourism expenses that they themselves contribute, the expenses that their families contribute when visiting, and indeed international students provide a valuable resource for our communities and our workforce in the years ahead. I agree with all of that. Everyone agreed with all of that, and so for that purpose we also accept the premise that it would be ideal to have a top 100 university. We kind of do, but there is certainly that question mark over how sustainable Adelaide University's position in the top 100 is, and that also informed the Liberal Party's consideration as we come to deal with this issue. The second proposition that the government put forward in their promise for this issue was that South Australia's higher education sector must be actively engaged with local industry and business to optimise local investment, commercialisation of research and economic growth. It is, but we would like it to continue to be, so sure, happy to accept that. I just want to reflect briefly though. I don't want to take it for granted, as some people seem to do, that our universities don't do pretty good work in this area at the moment. If you go to Tonsley and talk to the people at Flinders University about the work they're doing commercialising their research, it's a startup hub of some note. And indeed, Flinders students and Flinders researchers who have engaged with business are doing extraordinarily successfully, as are Adelaide University researchers in their areas of key focus. Adelaide University has some very, very proud success stories in this area. And you know, the other university that does is the University of South Australia, on a smaller scale to be sure. But the idea that our universities don't do that at the moment is, I think, a bit of a misnomer, but we'd like them to continue to do so. The third proposition for the proposal from the government is that the South Australian university sector needs to be stable and productive. Securing jobs and career pathways for academics, researchers and administrative staff will strengthen the university sector here. No problem with that. Number 4, students from all socioeconomic backgrounds must have access to a university education in South Australia of an elite global standard, and students require internationally competitive employment outcomes in order to be sure that the investment of going to university will be of immediate and lasting value to them. Dwell on this moment for a moment. The University of South Australia has some of the strongest graduate outcomes of any university in Australia. By some measures, it's number 1 in Australia. Not in South Australia, in Australia. The other measures of teacher quality, student satisfaction, by those measures, there are strong results from all 3 of our universities. I think Flinders may even be ranked at the top, and UniSA, if not Flinders, and Adelaide University is 3rd of the 3 universities, but they're all definitely in the top quartile of Australian universities. Some of Australia's top-ranked universities feature very poorly by comparison in relation to the graduate outcomes and student satisfaction rankings. The point I make is that it is utterly wrong-headed for the government to pursue this only on the basis that you're going to have students desperate to be in a globally highly ranked institution in order to achieve their career goals. South Australia's students are extremely well served by all 3 of our institutions at the moment. when it comes to the quality of teaching and learning and graduate satisfaction. The measures suggest that. And there is also not the correlation that is assumed in Labor's document between having a highly ranked university and indeed graduate satisfaction. Again, the benefit of a highly ranked university over and above everything else is in attracting international students, and the function that drives having a highly ranked university more than anything else is the volume, not of research, but the volume of that top quality research. It's not the only thing that feeds into most of the rankings, but nevertheless, it is not a function that actually drives the domestic market particularly strongly. There are all sorts of factors that feature in a South Australian student's desire to go to a particular university over another. I've spoken to a range of people throughout this journey. I spoke to student representatives from different clubs and organisations at the universities. I've spoken to colleagues, friends, family. Everybody has a view on this matter, whether they have been to university or not, especially if they've been to one of the institutions. But one of the questions I would ask is, what drove you to make your decision to go to Adelaide or Flinders or UniSA or any number? For the record, the South Australian Liberal Parliamentary team is made up of graduates of all three and with significant advocates for the education they received in the different institutions. I've spoke to people who'd made their decision based on geography. It was the university down the road from where I live. This is something that's very popular at Flinders University. People in the southern suburbs are very proud of the fact that their institution is on track to, is delivering great teaching and learning. Many people in the regions, for example, people living in Mount Gambier, very much appreciate the offering that UniSA has in Mount Gambier. Students may choose to go to a particular university because they want to go to a particular course. If they want to be a paramedic, then they have to go to Flinders because that's where being a paramedic is offered. Some students had a particular interest in doing subjects or disciplines that are only offered at Adelaide. There is a smaller cohort that are attracted to a university because their parent might have gone to that university or there's a reputation attached, but by no means comparable to the driver for an international student that rankings are. And we heard significant evidence to that extent as well. People are proud of their university and they take pride in the things that their university points to. Adelaide University, I'm a graduate of Adelaide University. I did subjects at Flinders University as well. I'm proud that my university had the connection with Howard Florey, who I think is one of the most important people who lived in the 20th century and who did study at Adelaide University. I think that that is something that brings me joy. It doesn't necessarily influence my feeling about the merger by any stretch. But the idea that it would be an elite global standard that somehow wasn't achieved, I think actually is an insult to our universities as they stand. The fifth purpose that the Labor Party had for their election policy was all SA public universities must remain strong regardless of a merger configuration, and there must be a relationship between higher education and vocational training that facilitates increasing the qualification levels held by South Australians. Now, to be honest, nobody's really talked about the second part of the fifth one. So this is two promises. First, regardless of the configuration, all South Australian universities must remain strong. We'll come back to talk more about Flinders in due course, but I don't think that the particular package that the government has settled on adequately deals with that. We've said many times that Flinders University needs to be given more consideration. But the proposal as it is doesn't hugely go into this question of the relationship between higher education and vocational training. There is other work that is important in relation to vocational training. There's other work that I'm very proud of that was delivered under the Marshall Liberal government, aimed at increasing the number of people successfully completing apprenticeships and traineeships. Support for the group training organisation sector, for example, where the national average of some 50-something% of apprenticeship and traineeship completions rises up into about 80% completions. And so the former government's strong support for GTOs and for apprenticeship and traineeships, I think, was an important part of that. The former government's reforms to vet in schools was an important part of that. The idea that the school week shouldn't be the only determinant of whether a young person can do a school-based apprenticeship or traineeship. The idea that schools should work to enable participation in the workplace first, and then the school provide extra supports to help students complete their SACE while undertaking their apprenticeship or traineeship. The idea also that states' funding for vocational education schools should be geared towards where there are skills demand areas, whether that's through an apprenticeship or a traineeship. If a business is taking on an apprentice, then there's a demand for the skill, because otherwise the business wouldn't be putting money in the game. Or indeed the skills shortage lists that have been identified. That's where we put our money, changing it from the previous one, which is we'd fund any student to do any course once, and then when they found there was no job at the end, they'd have to pay for it themselves if they wanted to do more. That reform, focusing our training effort within schools on areas that had skills needs, that was really important. The new government's kept it. That work's important. It was one of the promises that they would look at here, and maybe I take from it that they were so satisfied, sir, by the work the Marshall Liberal government did in reforming VET in schools and pathways, that they didn't feel the need to focus on that anymore. That's how I'll take it. So we turn back to the recommendations of the committee. Indeed, I'll turn to the process. This was dealt with particularly in the minority report. And the point that I would make is that having not gone through the process of having a commission of inquiry, as the explicit promise of the election document was, the government could have said, well, we've decided not to do our election commitment because the universities have come to us with a better idea. That's not what they said. They've said effectively that their election commitment is being fulfilled by delivering on this better idea that the universities have come to us with. Now, the reason why whether or not it is an election commitment is important is because that does slightly adjust the process that a cabinet needs to go through. If something has been an election commitment, then there is an obligation upon the government to deliver on that election commitment. And the long policy considerations that you might expect from Treasurer's Instruction 17, that Cabinet needs to consider a justification statement, that the justification statement should apply evaluation principles that are appropriate for the size and nature of the public sector initiative being evaluated, and having regard to the estimated cost, magnitude and sensitivity includes sufficient scope and details to enable the approver to make the decision on an informed basis. If something's an election commitment, then it is deemed that that work is effectively having been done through the publication of the promise prior to the election, the consideration by the people of South Australia in forming their views on who should form government. There's a benefit to the government in describing this policy proposal as an election commitment, even though it is indeed not the delivery of their election commitment. It is an alternative to their election commitment. What we observed through the committee was some of the most surprising testimony that I've encountered in my nearly 14 years in the Parliament. And it was very clear from the way that the public servants spoke about this proposal that they were under writing instructions, if you like. They were under no doubt that the government's view was that this merger, supporting this merger, was the election commitment. That was their interpretation of the election commitment. Now, we've gone through the document, said what the election commitment was in some detail. I apologise to members who didn't want to spend the last 20 minutes going through the Labor Party election document, but it's very clear in black and white that the policy document was for a university commission. We went through the 5 things that the commission would consider. Now, if they decided not to have the commission, decided to do that work through another model, that would be a variation on the election commitment. But it wasn't that. They didn't do that work. In fact, the public servants explicitly ruled out having done that work. Witness testimony, and we couldn't have been clearer, because I went back and asked these questions a couple of times because I was surprised at the answers that we were getting. I think the member for Adelaide might have asked a pertinent question in relation to policy advice, in relation to whether the witnesses thought it was a good idea, and I think they said that it was. And I asked, was that the first time that you have been asked by anyone in government for policy advice on this question? They made it clear that they were not there to provide policy advice to government on this matter. They were there to work on the bill that would deliver on Labor's election commitment. The bill that is, as has been mentioned, in the other place at the moment, and presumably, not wanting to make reflections on what we expect the other place to do, but there's certainly a possibility it'll be here in the next sitting week. It's really unusual that such a significant proposition would have no policy advice provided by government. It's not to say whether or not the merits of the bill, the merits of the proposal are good or bad. It is a duty of government to be fully informed of a decision before they take it. The members of the public service identified that their policy work would have been done by the universities to inform their business cases that were going to the university councils. When asked if those business cases had been provided to the department, it became clear that aspects of the business cases had been provided. The department was given information that it requested, but it did not request the full business cases to be provided. No one in government, as far as we can tell, has read all of the documents that the university councils have read. The university councils considered business cases that were relevant to their institutions. A lot of that material was shared material, and some of it was specific to their institutions, because, of course, if the university merger did not go ahead, then those universities would want to protect their own information and interests going forward. So at this point, I'll take us back briefly to 2018. 2018, when I was the Minister for Education, I had the opportunity to bear witness to an earlier discussion of this. Now, it was reflected on by a couple of the members of the committee, a couple of witnesses to the committee, what happened in 2018, and at least one of them put on the record some statements that I knew to be, at the very least, wild exaggerations of what I remember to be the case. I would also put on draw to the Chamber's attention that the second reading speech given by the Attorney-General in the other place in relation to the bill that comes out of this document suggests that the former government's lack of interest in supporting the university was the problem, and this government being interested in providing financial resources to the university was the difference. It's going to make it work. What happened in 2018 was the two universities organically coming together, the Vice-Chancellors and the Chancellors discussing the proposal and coming to government. And the government at that stage was absolutely, as we are now, our statements from the Premier and from myself as Minister for Education to the institutions was that we were more than happy to facilitate a merger if that was something the institutions wanted to do and if it was something that was going to be in the state's interest. That remains our position today, and I'll put a bit more meat on the bones in the coming minutes of where that lands us. But in 2018, the stumbling block was not the government's willingness or unwillingness to entertain the idea. We took every meeting that we were invited to. We were very clear that if resources from the government were needed at some level, then we would entertain such considerations. We would just needed to be provided with the ask. The universities never made it to that point. The university's councils determined not to proceed on a basis, as best I can tell, because I wasn't in the council meetings, but that they weren't able to agree on certain factors. It's been suggested the name was still a stumbling block. So when the university vice-chancellors, as they are now, came up and agreed in terms of a transition process and a name, that is a different outcome to what happened 4 years ago. The universities were also in an extremely different financial position 4 years ago. In 2018 and 2019, the level of government investment required to underpin the proposal would have probably been less than is required now because they hadn't been through COVID. Indeed, a substantial amount of the ask from universities in relation to this matter is to underpin the Council's confidence that they are not going to reach any sort of liquidity floor in what they might do as the merger proceeds. The universities had more money prior to the pandemic. The universities had to apply resources during the pandemic to keep staff, to keep students going, to maintain level of service and to deal with the challenges everyone had during the pandemic. The point I make is the circumstances were different, and the reason that it didn't proceed in 2018 was actually in no way due to interest or lack of interest or support or lack of support from the government. It was a decision the universities took. And we do accept that the universities in this occasion have come to the decision differently. The Vice-Chancellors, one of the Vice-Chancellors is new. One of the Vice-Chancellors is new, two of the Chancellors are new, and indeed there is therefore a different set of circumstances that we're dealing with. And there is a simpatico clearly between the two organisations at a leadership level, and we accept, as is clear, that the universities do see it being in their interest. So that's the first stage cleared. The second stage is whether it's in the state's interests. Now, my critique of the government is highlighted in the sixth recommendation in the minority report, that being that we believe that any public sector initiative being considered by Cabinet should include a justification statement setting out the implications of the initiative. The justification statement should apply evaluation principles that are appropriate for the size and nature of the public sector initiative being evaluated, and having regard to the estimated cost, magnitude and sensitivity, include sufficient scope and details to enable the approver to make the decision on an informed basis. That is the law at the moment. Treasurer's Instruction 17 is empowered under Section 41 of the Public Finance and Audit Act to require that of government. What we therefore request is that all ministers in this government and future governments give consideration as to how they're fulfilling their responsibilities under the law, under Treasurer's Instruction 17. Simply saying something was an election commitment doesn't make it so, and it doesn't obviate your responsibilities to fulfil your obligations under the law. Ministers need to be very mindful that they're talking about a bill that will not only facilitate the provision of several hundred millions of dollars over the period of time of public monies, but also that will have an impact on our state that's quite significant beyond the financial impact, beyond international students. And I guess I just really want to focus in on this for a moment. We're talking about a social impact on South Australia that cannot necessarily be measured in whether 5,000 or 7,000 international students might bring an extra $100 million to the institution, might bring in an extra $100 million in research funding, might bring in extra funding. We're talking about teaching our graduates, our professionals, our teachers, our doctors, our lawyers, our engineers, our scientists, our accountants, our economists, our policy officers, our social workers, the people who require a degree to participate in our workforce, our businesses, our public sector institutions that require degree-educated and qualified people, our researchers themselves, our school principals, our public servants. The quality of their education is really important, sir. The experience they have at university is very important. And I think in a lot of the public discussion, it was just assumed that ranking had a relevance to the quality of education. And the truth is, actually, it seems unfortunately, the rankings don't have much of a correlation with that. We have schools of law and education at both of the universities at the moment. They do things differently. One of the challenges is going to be getting that right. Because the consequence of getting it wrong is not just financial risk, although we'll get to that shortly. The consequence of getting it wrong is that South Australia, the university that's turning out 2/3 to 3/4 of our teachers, our doctors, our lawyers, our accountants and so forth, will be giving them less of an experience than they have at the moment. Any merger proposition should only be supported or considered, in my view, on the basis that their experience will be at least as good as it is at the moment, because it's a good experience at the moment. The rankings, not of the university rankings, but the ratings under the various registers of the quality of teaching and learning suggest that our students are having a good experience at the moment. It's a risk to bring those schools together, especially when they're, in many cases, using different pedagogies or different focus areas to deliver their course materials. So, there are a range of risks to this proposal going forward in the way that we would like it to. The opportunities are understood and they're clear. We set out in our minority report that an alternative to the first recommendation should have been a finding that Jing Li and I agreed with that on the balance of the evidence considered by the committee, the economic and social interests of the state of South Australia might be advanced by the proposed amalgamation, but members should note that these opportunities carry with them a number of considerable risks that need to be mitigated. We said the proposal is not objectively good or bad. It is a subjective call with opportunities and risks inherent in either approach. Members might also be persuaded there are risks in maintaining the status quo that haven't previously been fully articulated. I thought the member for Adelaide spoke pretty well about these just a moment ago. The potential benefits of the proposal certainly merit the Parliament's serious consideration, but to dismiss the concerns and risks, such as those raised by a range of eminent individuals and interested stakeholders throughout this committee inquiry, without taking further steps in mitigation, would be foolhardy and not in the state's interests. We believe that while informed members acting in good faith could reasonably conclude that the risks inherent in the proposal are worth taking or not, we suggest the measures presented in recommendations 2 to 7 in the majority report are essential if the proposal were to proceed, noting that we also in the minority report recommended further measures to strengthen those recommendations. We feel those measures should have been considered as part of a full Cabinet process prior to the announcement of the proposal, with submissions including details of all these issues. We know that Cabinet considered this proposal, it considered the spending appropriation, it considered the bill, but evidence many matters in the report, the majority report and the minority report alike, do not seem to have been the subject of rigorous policy analysis or advice from a department prior to Cabinet making its decision. Now, 2 weeks ago, the government did a press conference with the Honourable Sarah Game and the Honourable Connie Benares, setting out that those two members were going to support the bill, and there were two amendments to the proposal that were announced at that press conference. At that press conference, the government confirmed it was going to add an extra $20 million to the scholarship fund, which would be particularly focused on supporting regional students, and it was going to provide a new scholarship fund worth $40 million for Flinders University, or Equity Fund. So those things are welcome, but they don't address some of the key issues we're having to grapple with. So to be clear, we feel there are 4 main areas of concern that this Parliament can consider. The first being the risks inherent in the proposal. I'll talk at some greater length about them. The second being the impact on Flinders University. The third being the opportunity or lack of for our regions. And the fourth being in relation to the McGill campus. Risk I've dealt with at some time. I want to commend the University Vice-Chancellors at this point. The University Vice-Chancellors from Adelaide University and the University of South Australia have been good enough to provide a letter to the opposition in response to our minority report and in response to the suggestions. Because while the Equity Fund for Flinders is welcomed, while the $20 million increase to the Equity Fund for Adelaide for rural students, we certainly don't have a problem with providing more scholarships. They don't address a couple of the key things. They don't address the need, we believe, for there to be research equity between Flinders and the new institution, and they don't address the strong view that Jing Li and I presented that we need to have proactive support for those students who want to study in regional South Australia. Not just for students who want to come from regional Australia to the city. We want to see more opportunities for people to study in regional South Australia, more opportunities for regional communities to benefit from regional students being able to stay in their towns, whether they're doing nursing or teaching or medical training or whatever the course may be. Those matters, while they weren't addressed by the government and they aren't addressed in the bill, the Liberal Party will make commitments to address those matters further should we and when we win government in March 2026. In relation to Magill, I'll spend some time talking about that in a moment, but in relation to Magill, what has become clear, I commend members of the committee for acknowledging the need to support the childcare centre at Magill, and the recommendation in the majority report was supported, I don't think anyone will mind me saying, by all members. It was very welcome. But there are significant assets for the community, for biodiversity, for heritage and for active and passive recreation, on particularly on the western side of St Bernard's Road, that need to be further addressed. And a Liberal government in the future will ensure that community needs are first and foremost there. When it comes to the risk of the proposal overall, the University Vice-Chancellors, I want to commend them for their response to the minority report. The Vice-Chancellors wrote to us and they said, firstly, we wish to acknowledge the careful and constructive way in which both you and the wider committee have engaged with the University as part of the parliamentary process. They went on to write, the minorities report's recommendations propose a number of matters for consideration. Some are directed towards the government, others relate to how the universities could best manage the transition period and post-merger activities of Adelaide University. We wish to respond in broad terms to those recommendations. Now, I'll get to the bits that they talk about risk, and they do identify measures that they're now taking that have not been announced prior to the release of the report that will help mitigate those risks. And in the context of the fact that the government has secured the numbers in the Legislative Council, we certainly acknowledge that this is going to go ahead and we need to deal with the risks. The Vice-Chancellors also talk about regional delivery and acknowledging the calls in the minority report for more work to be done in regional South Australia. The Vice-Chancellors highlight, and I'll quote from their letter again, the universities and a future Adelaide University will subject... in fact, I'll go back. They say that the recently released interim report of the Australian Universities Accord has listed as a priority the establishment of regional university centres and suburb university centres throughout Australia. The universities welcome this initiative and will be engaging with the Commonwealth to ensure that South Australia receives the appropriate level of support. It also believes that its curriculum and access ambitions align with the Accord's priorities. We would very much welcome state-based initiatives of this type to underpin greater access to our offerings around South Australia. The universities and a future Adelaide University will, subject to sufficient demand and support, actively engage with any such state policy initiatives designed to establish regional hubs or learning centres. As the founding legislation for the new Adelaide University obligates, and the existing regional campuses of our two institutions demonstrate, the new university intends to serve the state, not just metropolitan Adelaide. As such, Adelaide University would, subject to the appropriate assessment, be extremely well placed to being an anchor tenant in any regional initiative that may be advanced in the future. Now, I'll come back to that letter in a moment, but I want to just put on the record my appreciation to the Vice-Chancellors for engaging with the opposition in such a constructive way. The witnesses that were provided to the committee included dozens of people arguing for and against the proposal, and indeed many who provided expert advice, dispassionate about the merits or otherwise of the proposal. The Vice-Chancellors appeared twice, and indeed their other senior leaders appeared a third time in camera to provide some of the further foundation details. For the Vice-Chancellors to see the University Committee report and the minority report and take seriously its recommendations and findings, that they would then engage with the opposition in a constructive and positive way, even after the government had secured the numbers to pass their bill, I think speaks very highly of their credibility and their desire to see positive outcomes come from this process. And I thank the Vice-Chancellors for doing that work and for providing further recognition of the concerns raised by the opposition in our minority report and in the public, and some level of comfort to us that they were being addressed. And I'll talk about some of those risk mitigation strategies. I imagine that a number of members of the House will be eager to learn that the opposition will be supporting the bill to establish the new university. We do this in the context that this proposal is too big to fail. The government has secured an agreement from Connie Benares and Sarah Game that they will support. We can count the numbers in the Legislative Council. This bill was passed in the Legislative Council this week, irrespective of what the Liberal Party does. And in that circumstance, in the beginning of 2026, we will have a new university in South Australia. It'll be responsible for educating 2/3 of our degree-qualified graduates, our accountants, our doctors, our teachers, our nurses, our lawyers, and a range of others, as we have said. This will also be responsible for 7,000 to 8,000 staff, for 60,000 to 70,000 students. It is one of those propositions that now it is going to happen. It is what they call too big to fail. And that is, I think, speaks to why more risk mitigation work needed to be done by the government. But it was clear 2 weeks ago that once they'd secured their votes that they needed, it was going ahead. They were very happy with themselves. The opposition looks at this from the state's interests. Now, there was a pathway available to the opposition to oppose this bill for political expediency, because there will be bumps along the road in the next couple of years. Make no mistake, sir. One of the biggest risks to the proposition is if there are researchers who are operating at a high level at Adelaide University who leave the institution in the next couple of years, not being happy with the way the culture is working out, not being happy with the way the transition is working out, that will have an impact on rankings. I think everybody accepts that there's going to be a dip in the rankings for the new university compared to Adelaide University. The Vice-Chancellor's proposition is that it will return within a couple of years. Indeed, I think the documents they put out expect it certainly within 5 years. But it has been put to us by other witnesses that it could take 10 years or longer to see that return. And if the worst prognostications came to be true, if there was a 10-year return or worse on restoring the ranking, then the positive opportunities in this proposal won't be borne out. There is an issue of culture and confidence that has a direct implications for our future as a state, because if it did take longer than 5 years to bear out, then you wouldn't see the uptick in international students, you wouldn't see the uptick in revenue, and without that uptick in revenue, you wouldn't be able to invest in the sort of research that will see the continued prosperity that the proposal expects. The opportunities in this proposal are significant for our state, sir. They are. We recognise that. We've recognised it all along. But the risks need to be acknowledged and mitigated. And we don't believe the government did that. Now, one of the risks, therefore, is something that we would, if we took that politically expedient path, we would be contributing to that risk. I wonder, what would the Labor Party do if they were in opposition? And some have said, well, they would just oppose it, try and kill the bill in the Legislative Council, and if they couldn't, then they would spend the next 2 years seeking to undermine the proposal and taking political glee every time something went wrong. And the Liberal Party is not about that, because our interest is in the people of South Australia. We want our kids to be able to experience the best possible education and the best possible opportunities. And that wouldn't be served by taking the politically expedient path. So instead, we work on something that is more constructive. We will support this bill because it is going to pass and it is too big to fail, and it requires everyone to lean in to that effort. But more than that, we are also willing to put on the record today some policy commitments for when the Liberal Party forms government in March 2026. Some of the policy commitments that we can make now will alleviate some of the risks to our state getting the benefit from this proposal. At great length, the Honourable Jing Lee and I talk in our report, and indeed we talked about this in the committee. The Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University, Colin Sterling, talked at great length in the committee about the risks to South Australia fulfilling its opportunities here if Flinders University does not get the research support. Because with Adelaide University being the beneficiaries of at least $4 million a year, and most likely more than that as a result of the $200 million research fund, that's designed to secure new researchers doing high-quality research for Adelaide University, that money. Taxpayers are paying for that. Now, in attracting high-quality researchers to any institution, you can convince people to come from another country, you can convince people to come from another state. The easiest way is for somebody to be convinced to come from another side of town and change their commute, because it's easier to change your commute than to change your state or your country. And so there is a risk to our state fulfilling this opportunity if Flinders University is shut out from government funding for research. Flinders University does a range of research in very high quality areas that are aligned to our state's strategic plan. A Spears Liberal government, if elected in March 2026, will establish a research fund for Flinders University equivalent in its nature to that is being provided in this proposal for Adelaide University. The detail in terms of the size of the fund required and the returns that it will bear every year will be announced between now and the next election. But the scope of work that it will do will be in alignment with our state strategic priorities. Flinders University is a world-leading university when it comes to research in defence, science and technology in matters that are directly related to our AUKUS agreement and our AUKUS opportunities for our state, and this will be an area that Flinders University's research will benefit directly our state. It will be an area to which this research fund will be applied. Flinders University is a world-leading institution when it comes to agtech, agricultural technology, food production, technology and science. And this is an area where funding from the Spears Liberal Government's Flinders University Research Fund will be applied in direct benefit for our state's interests. Flinders University is one of the world's leading universities in relation to a range of health science and research areas. Curing diseases, there is extraordinary work being done at Flinders University. And particularly in this area, which is also a focus for the new institution, we would want to ensure that the work that Flinders is doing is not undermined by the government-funded support for the new institution. We want them both to thrive, sir. We want them to be the best two universities in Australia when it comes to health science research. And so that is also an area where the Spears Liberal Government's proposed Flinders Uni Research Fund will provide support to Flinders University. So that's the first thing. We will provide a Flinders University Research Fund in government, and it will ensure, while there will be a cost to the budget, the nature of the way in which the Adelaide University Research Fund could well be reflected here. So the money, the capital stays in the hands of the South Australian people. It sits on our balance sheet, and it is indeed a cost that is only in the terms of the foregone revenue, which is a modest, would likely be a modest single-digit number in the millions that is not in our balance sheet going forward. In the context of the state budget, this is eminently affordable, but it does reduce the risk of South Australia not realising the opportunity that this proposal presents. The second area where the Spears Liberal Government elects in March 2026, should we receive that honour from the South Australian people, we will commit to further support for regional South Australia. So Flinders University is a very, very important university in the Australian context, particularly for the South. Our regions and the support we give our regions is critically important as well. Now, the deal done 2 weeks ago identified $20 million, which presumably might have a return of $1 million a year for our students to receive scholarships, one imagines mostly to come to the city. When students come to Adelaide, it's important regional students are supported in doing so, and we certainly will maintain that extra fund. But what's even more exciting is when students are able to access great education in the regions as well. We want to see the existing effort maintained as a minimum. We're talking about campuses at Mount Gambier and Whyalla, Roseworthy, and indeed there are other efforts the universities are making at the moment. And we want to see that net impact realised. But we also have seen the development in recent years of uni hubs around Australia. There's one at Port Pirie, for example, which a number of members would be very familiar with, where it's not just that there is an offering available to students through the anchor tenant, and indeed the anchor tenant in Port Pirie is not a South Australian university, but from the east, the northeast. But also it provides that resource within a community for other university students to be able to engage with their curriculum when they're not able to be on campus in Adelaide. The factors that entered our thinking here is that there are parts of South Australia that are relatively well serviced. Potentially those regional centres don't have a wide variety of choices available to them in terms of what subjects are able to be offered, what courses are able to be offered. But certainly the access to facilities is there. One of the factors in the new university's curriculum development that is interesting here is the way that they're proposing to rewrite the curriculum in a modular nature. Stackable, some people would call it. You can do aspects of different degrees at different times. This would lend itself well to regional delivery, where you might have a student doing remote learning, access enabled by the internet for periods, and then have hands-on engagement with lecturers or courses at different times, whether that's coming to the city or indeed a local hub. We'd like to see more of that. It appears the Liberal government will commit to maintaining existing effort, and sometimes that will mean applying state resources, but more than that, we will see at least one new uni hub in regional South Australia in areas that aren't currently serviced by our existing effort. This will require investment, new investment, state government resources, which would have been a good way for the government to go in the last couple of weeks when they were talking about their scholarship fund, but instead they focused only on things that will help those students who are in a position to come to Adelaide. We are much more interested in seeing communities supported as well as that. Because if you want somebody to be teaching in a regional area, as we always do, and as we know there are skill shortages in teaching, in early childhood, in nursing, in medical, in medical across the board, one of the best ways to get yourself somebody who's eager to work in regional South Australia is to have somebody who's grown up in regional South Australia, who sees it as their community. And the more time they're able to engage with their education in a regional area, the higher likelihood it is that they will seek to stay in that regional area upon graduation. So we want to make it as easy as possible. That's why we think this is a tremendously important area that the government has neglected to deal with in this report. This is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to the Vice-Chancellors for engaging with the opposition, because the Vice-Chancellors keenly and clearly understood the issue that Jing Li and I raised in our minority report here that wasn't addressed by the government and the relevant crossbenchers in their deal a couple of weeks ago. The opportunity to nail down extra support and resources for students who want to study in regional South Australia, not just from regional South Australia. And that's something the Liberal Party is committed now to doing. The third commitment that the Liberal Party will give, should we win the next election, is in relation to the community surrounding the land at Magill. Now, the committee heard evidence, strong evidence from the Honourable Vincent Tarsier, member for Hartley, in relation to his views and his community's reaction to the proposal and what their fears might be about what might happen with the land in that area. The committee heard evidence from the Campbelltown Council, from former Labor Minister, the Honourable Chris Schott, who is a local resident, who talked about the important role that creek line plays through the campus in his daily recreation, and that of hundreds and hundreds of other residents. There is two patches of land in question when it comes to Magill. One is on the eastern side of the road. It's in my electorate of Morialta, and it is scheduled under this proposal to be sold and master planned by Renewal SA sooner rather than later. It may well be that this has been disposed of before the next election. In doing so, I very strongly encourage the government to look at submissions from Campbelltown Council and others in relation to that land, maintaining sufficient open space that the community still has access to open space in that area, which has been very heavily developed, maintaining access to community recreation facilities such as Campbelltown Council proposed would be the best case scenario for that land. The government has a decision to make soon on that, and I urge them to make the right decision and support the community. In relation to the western half of the land, the proposal in front of the Parliament put forward by the government is that UniSA can have 5 years on their lease with an option for 5 more, and so in 5 or 10 years' time that land will then be developed in one way or another. Now, it is the very clear understanding of the Liberal Party and as very articulately represented by the Honourable Vincent Tarsier, member for Hartley, in whose electorate that land resides, that there are community assets in that area that is tremendously important. The Magill Campus and Community Childcare Children's Centre is a really important community long daycare service that dozens and dozens of families currently use. They have a waiting list and they want certainty about that site going forward. Now, the committee has recommended the government engage with them as soon as possible. My understanding is the government will. I commend the government for that and urge them to do so. That has to be protected for childcare, long day care, early education and indeed child development. They do an excellent job there And certainly, given the government's stated aims for early childhood development, it would be odd, frankly, if they didn't renew that lease and support that childcare centre's continued opportunity to thrive. There is also active and passive recreation facilities there. There's an oval that's used every weekend. There is a heritage building in Murray House that is stunning. Anyone driving down St Bernard's Road will know the building I'm talking about. And there is a creek line which has very high level biodiversity and environmental value. These need protecting. Now, Renewal SA, in their evidence to the committee, did suggest they saw more value potentially to be realised. It may have been Renewal SA or it may have been Treasury, but they're interested in selling more housing on the east side of the road than the west. But we make it very abundantly clear that when it comes particularly to that land that the government won't have sold by the time of the next election, a Spears Liberal government will be very focused on making sure that community needs are met, and that means reflecting the opportunity for heritage value of Murray House, for the active and passive recreation opportunities, including organised sports that use those facilities, the childcare centre, pardon me, the tree line, the creek line be protected in the consideration of any development there, and community must be front and centre in those expectations. So with that in mind, those three commitments the Liberal Party offers today on the 31st of October 2023 for what we will deliver in 2026. And it's important to recognise these things. One of the reasons the Vice-Chancellors at Adelaide University and the University of South Australia were eager for the perpetual funds to have a floor on how much money they will generate for the first 8 years, as is in the legislation, for their research and equity, is because they need to be able to plan during this risky transition process, during this risky transition period. They need to be able to confirm what the financial commitments they can make are, and do so on a basis not just of using their existing resources and the combined sum of their existing budgets, but also have the security that if there is a revenue dip in the next couple of years as a result of the required expenditure in transition, there are potential issues with retaining numbers of international students during the riskiest first couple of years, they need that surety that they're going to have that income coming in. So the timing of our commitments, we have a bit of time to work out. We feel that the problem with the perpetual funds being created for Adelaide University, not Flinders, is not the short-term provision of finance to assist with the merger. The government could have just given a grant to facilitate a merger. The problem with them was providing perpetual funds that will go on forever, only in one institution's benefit. And that is why, in the long term, Flinders has to be taken into consideration when it comes to this. When it comes to the engagement of the Vice-Chancellors, I spoke a little bit about this earlier, but I'm going to read the letter that they sent to the opposition because I think it's important. They've said that they're happy for this to become a public document. It was sent outlining their stated positions, articulating some new information and responding to some of the issues raised in the Minority Report. It's not a secret document. It's a document I received yesterday and I'm releasing publicly today. But for the record, dear Mr. The letter is marked with the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia's crests. To John Gardner, Deputy Leader of the Opposition, that's me, sir. 30th of October 2023. Dear Mr Gardner, we're writing to provide a response to the Minority Report by yourself and the Honourable Jing Lee MLC as part of the Joint Committee on the Establishment of Adelaide University. Firstly, we wish to acknowledge the careful and constructive way in which both you and the wider committee have engaged with the universities as part of this parliamentary process. We believe that the ambition of the new university is clear. As captured in our first collective vision statement, and they quote, Australia's new for-purpose university is a leading contemporary comprehensive university of global standing. We are dedicated to ensuring the prosperity, well-being and cohesion of society by addressing educational inequality through our actions and through the success and impact of our students, staff and alumni. Partnered with the communities we serve, we conduct outstanding future-making research of scale and focus. They go on. The Minority Report's recommendations propose a number of matters for consideration. Some are directed towards the government, others relate to how the universities could best manage the transition period and post-merger activities of Adelaide University. We wish to respond in broad terms to those recommendations regarding to risk and regional delivery. Risk and its mitigation. The universities, in their various submissions and evidence before the Joint Committee, outlined the detailed attention that has been given to matters of risk and their mitigation. We acknowledge the risks are tangible, though manageable, and in our view outweigh the longer-term risk of not pursuing this opportunity. The universities have put in place very detailed plans and mitigations relating to all aspects of the merger, not all of which is in the public domain for competition purposes. However, there is some additional information we would like to provide you as part of our response to the Minority Report. Following a rigorous tender and procurement process with independent probity, the universities have jointly appointed Deloitte as our integration management partner. Deloitte has a proven track record of delivering successful integration projects of substantial complexity. They will support critical subject areas such as integration and transformation oversight, project management and quality assurance, business process design, systems integration, change management, and the communication frameworks. This partnership is one of the key measures that has been taken to de-risk this merger. This next paragraph, I think, is very important, sir. Staff retention and attraction during any complex change of this scale is a risk. It is one that the university has identified early as part of its transition planning. Processes and procedures have been put in place to retain and minimise the loss of key staff with an ambition to attract and retain more talent in the medium to long term. While the pre-legislative period does cause a level of uncertainty, we cannot yet identify any discernible trend to suggest that staff are departing the universities due to the merger. Indeed, the universities can report the appointment of several senior and highly credentialed academics since the announcement of the merger, including from Oxford University, Durham University, St Andrews University, University of Southern Denmark, and from leading Australian universities. The New Adelaide University is committed to enhancing the student experience and do not believe that the lived experience in a merged university will be in any way diminished. The enhancement of the student experience has been identified as a key institutional strategic goal, is a key transition path, and is an area in which planning has already commenced. Indeed, it is proposed that Adelaide University will appoint a Deputy Vice-Chancellor whose primary portfolio attention will be upon student experience and success. The universities welcomed the focus that the Joint Committee placed on the risks involved in this merger. The universities have always anticipated the risks and have spent considerable time identifying and putting in place management plans to address them. Just before I go on to the rest of their letter, I identify particularly the evidence that is in relation to staff retention. I think that this was possibly, as I may have said before, one of the biggest cultural risks in any transition process, in any merger process of any institution, is that your key staff aren't enjoying that experience, aren't enjoying that cultural change and depart. We're talking about people who are able to get jobs anywhere in the world. And while Adelaide and South Australia is obviously, sir, I know that you will agree, as we all do, the best place in the world to live. We have that going for us. There is a risk that they could get offered more money elsewhere at a culture they might feel more inclined to stay with. To see the benefits of this opportunity realised, if the business case, if the publicly released figures in terms of opportunity for international students and for money, if they are to be realised, this staff retention is number 1, 2 and 3 in terms of being able to realise them. The second issue that I talked about earlier was student experience being an important focus, that in an initiative by a university aimed at the financial benefits of international students' rankings and research, that the student experience not be lost as well. And that the university is being proactive in seeking now and advertising, I think in the last week, to recruit a new Deputy Vice-Chancellor of student experience and success, highlights, I think, a willingness of the Vice-Chancellors to engage with a number of the issues that were raised during the University Committee's considerations and the Minority Report in particular. So I commend them for doing so, and I thank them for releasing the details of staff that have been recruited. In our Minority Report, I think we focused some time talking about how there is limited data to establish whether or not there is confidence or opposition amongst the majority of staff to the process. The university, the NTEU, the Academics Union, did a survey. I think they had some 1,400 responses from the 3 universities, which combined have in the order of about 10,000 staff. The Vice-Chancellors put out information in March that welcomed people to provide questions or other responses. It wasn't a survey as such, but they had hundreds of responses too. But again, that was open to everyone in the community, and a relatively low percentage of people expressing an opinion. The Liberal Party of South Australia put out research into the field. We put out a website inviting members of the community, interested people, people from the universities to respond to the question of what they would support and provide their comments. We had about 1,700 responses, and it was about 40% in favour, 40% against and 20% in the middle. Exactly the sort of survey I'm sure you'd understand, sir, as a former State Secretary of the Labor Party. If you're looking to gauge community feeling, well, it's fair to say feelings were mixed in the community. And I think that it's fair to say that and widely acknowledged that there are some people in staff who are dead set against this proposal, and there are some who are very keen on the proposal. And I suspect of those who responded to most of the surveys, the more staff responded negatively than positively. That highlights the risk. But there's a significant majority of staff who didn't respond to any of the surveys. And we highlight in the minority report that there is therefore a subjective question as to the level of risk in terms of staff retention or staff recruitment with that cultural question over whether people are going to enjoy this merger process or not. It is true people have known this has likely been coming for a while. The universities and the government made an announcement late last year in November or December talking about the work that was going to be undertaken. Since March, April, they've had an idea of what the university was going to brand itself as, and since the heads of agreement in July, they've had an understanding of what was happening there. While there has always been the proposition the Parliament could reject the merger, the universities, and I think particularly the government, have spruiked hard, including through paid advertising, what the university would look like. In that context, it is fair to look at not just what might happen, but what has happened in the last year. And the data provided by the University Vice-Chancellors is therefore helpful in helping us form that view. It is new information, and I'm certainly, I know a couple of the researchers and lecturers in question in this list, and recognise the significant role that they'll play in the university going forward. The Vice-Chancellors went on, sir, in writing about regional delivery. And I quote again, regional delivery. As identified in the minority report, the viability of many offerings is dependent on scale. You correctly noted, and that's so I indicate they were talking about me and the Honourable Jing Lee. And they quote from our report, one area that merits serious consideration is that of courses with low student numbers. The committee heard evidence that a risk inherent in the status quo is for such courses. As they require subsidy from other parts of the university's budgets, the future of these courses might be vulnerable in times of financial pressure. It was suggested that the proposed scale of the new institution would give such courses a much stronger level of protection. This conclusion, they go on, is directly relevant to the regional campus and hubs. Both universities have invested in regional education and research in Mount Gambier, Whyalla, Roseworthy and the Waite. In addition, there are focused activities in Port Lincoln, Ceduna, Elizabeth and the AP Wylands. A university of scale provides the means by which the academic offerings in the regions become more sustainable and can possibly be further expanded. In designing and implementing a new curriculum for the new university, a fundamental principle is that student ambition and experience will be paramount. The new curriculum will be contemporary, modular, adaptable and stackable with digital underpinnings. The ability to engage with students through face-to-face, hybrid mode or online education will provide important means of access for students in the regions. We believe that this approach to curriculum design and delivery will allow more regional students to attend Adelaide University without necessarily relocating to Adelaide. The recently released interim report of the Adelaide University's Accord has listed as a priority through the establishment of regional university centres and suburb university centres throughout Australia. The universities welcome this initiative and will be engaging with the Commonwealth to ensure that South Australia receives the appropriate level of support. It also believes that its curriculum and access ambitions align with the Accord's priorities. We would very much welcome state-based initiatives of this type to underpin greater access to our offerings across South Australia. The universities and a future Adelaide University will, subject to sufficient demand and support, actively engage with any such state policy initiatives designed to establish regional hubs or learning centres. As the founding legislation for the new Adelaide University obligates, and the existing regional campuses of our two institutions demonstrate, The new university intends to serve the state, not just metropolitan Adelaide. As such, Adelaide University would, subject to appropriate assessment, be extremely well placed to being an anchor tenant in any regional initiative that may be advanced in the future. We again thank you for the opportunity to respond to aspects of the Minority Report. We are encouraged by the careful consideration that has been given to the establishment of the new Adelaide University. Yours sincerely, Professor Peter Hoy, AC, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Adelaide, and Professor David Lloyd, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia. The Vice-Chancellors in providing that document have been very helpful to the opposition. It's not the only reason that we've come to the view of supporting the bill. I say again, we were instructed by the numbers and the impact that our taking a politically expedient route would have potentially had on community confidence in the university. If this merger is going to take place, it is something that our state's prosperity and our future students' wellbeing and our staff's wellbeing demand that be done well. And it demands that there be done with a level of as much confidence as possible. And to this end, we will hold the government to account and we will call out issues within the university when they exist. Support for this bill does not give a blank cheque by any means for any failures that happen in the period ahead, because I think one of the biggest risks that we are left with is the way in which this whole process has been botched, in my view, from the start. Confidence from staff and students and the community at large is important going forward. And if a lack of confidence in the cultural of the transition and the culture of the university leads to people leaving, then it will highlight, I think, the failure of the government to bring people with them from the start. An election promise for a university commission assumed that there was going to be a level of public engagement in what the outcome would be. What we have instead is a predetermined outcome by the government, and therefore a process that did not involve further analysis of risk or benefit before the application of public funds being promised. And I think you've got to look at the staff piece, the question of bringing staff along, because I think it was either the first or second witness to the Joint Committee on the Establishment of Adelaide University was the union, who represent a good number of the staff, a significant proportion of the staff at the universities. They felt completely alienated from the process, a process required between the government and the university to be done behind closed doors. We heard from witnesses within government who'd been engaging in this process for months, prior to the announcement of the heads of agreement signed around the middle of the year. But staff who are expected to work in these facilities were operating in a vacuum of information. And all of the information released in the second half of last year and the first half of this year was really notable in terms of it being full of buzzwords and catchphrases and lacking any granular detail, lacking engagement effectively with the staff. Now, we understand the rigorous secrecy provisions around a cabinet process. The universities had to put up with that, as well as their own provisions around protecting their own data as well. But it's an unfortunate state of affairs that over the last 12 months, the staff and the student communities have not been brought along on the journey in the way that they could have been. So we will do our best in the months and years ahead to support the process as an opposition should, through holding the government to account on issues that come about. But it is important to note that the process could have been managed so much better by the government. And even if they were going to take the proposal from the universities and not pursue the commission, I think there were government processes that should have been held internally that provided a greater level of rigorous scrutiny on behalf of taxpayers and an approach to the release of information about the proposal that brought much more information to public light earlier, that brought more staff in particular concerns and enabled them to be addressed through proactive engagement earlier. So our support for the bill doesn't absolve the government of responsibility for any problems that we might see along the way, but we will support the universities in seeking to realise the potential of this ambition, because the alternative, if this fails, if this goes badly, could at the very least be very costly for the state, and at the very worst be very, very bad for the state in a long-term way. It's worth touching on this question of risk. So, risk to people living in the suburbs, whether that's near McGill or near Flinders University, risk to the research projects that Flinders is able to offer and the retention of its staff, and risks to lacking the full realisation of opportunities for the regions. Suburbs and regions and research, the commitments we've made for a new Liberal government in 2026 will alleviate a number of those challenges. But in terms of risks to the success of the project, I think it's worth turning some attention to those risks. The Minority Report highlights that there was evidence provided by a number of serious stakeholders to the inquiry whose evidence was, I don't think, given sufficient weight by the Majority Report. And in our Minority Report, we highlighted a couple of those. And I particularly draw members' attention to the appearances of the NTEU, the National Tertiary Education Union, and Professor Hamner on the 8th of August, and they also provided significant submissions to the review, which are publicly available. Professor Hamner, noting that the information provided, the submission provided by Adelaide University and UniSA came at the end of call for public submissions. Professor Hamner did a significant service to the state by then providing a subsequent reflections on their submissions as well, which was taken into evidence later as well. I encourage people to look at that. Professor Bebbington on the 10th of August 2023. Warren Bebbington was Vice-Chancellor of Adelaide University for an extended period of time. Very familiar with the organisation and very familiar with higher education policy. His testimony was dismissed by the government, I think, pretty blithely, and that's disappointing. I think that they would have done well to listen to some of the concerns he's raised, but nevertheless, members wishing to familiarise themselves with the risks that he talked about, his evidence was on the 10th of August this year, and the Hansard is available. Professor Derek Abbott appeared on the 6th of September, and I'm probably going to start reflecting on some of the risks that he raised, but people can again read through the Hansard to read that engagement. And Professor Thomas on the 21st of September, a distinguished academic with an extraordinary career in scientific fields, making an extraordinary contribution towards South Australia's success. Now, it should be noted, I think at least a couple of these witnesses are still serving at Adelaide University at a very high level, are no doubt contributing to the positive rankings that Adelaide University has through the quality of their research work. And indeed, they are the subject of public acclaim in many cases for some of the things that they have achieved through their work. Now, that's not to say that I agree with all of the risks and concerns that they have raised. Some of the confidence I have that this can succeed, not necessarily that it will succeed, but can succeed, is a result of some of the questions that we're able to ask in the in-camera session. So the committee considered evidence from the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia in camera on one date and received submissions from them related to material that was commercially sensitive, that was commercial in confidence in some ways, that underlined the business case and in particular the risk register and mitigation impacts. The universities and the government have not wanted to release the business case, of course, that we've heard the Premier and the Deputy Premier didn't read. They've not wanted to release it because they were concerned about the opportunities that it might give their competitor universities. And an example, for example, if we're looking to pitch to an international student market, then we don't want Sydney University or Monash University to know our plans for that, so therefore there was a risk to the state in that, and we accept that. The universities also identified that they didn't want necessarily the line items of some of the budget spends to be particularised, because that would leave the new institution in a weakened situation when trying to compete with suppliers. For example, one of the key expenses in a merger will be the assimilation of IT systems, enabling the university staff to operate on a standard IT system and indeed have protection from cyber attack with confidence, and indeed have a positive IT system that would engage the student learner experience as well as research. And I don't think anyone here will be surprised that the experience of government and large institutions is these are extraordinarily expensive things. It's not identified in a line item publicly because the university is understandably not wanting to put themselves at a disadvantage when negotiating with potential suppliers. But nevertheless, that is something that does feed into the confidence or otherwise that people might have in whether risk mitigations are in place. I think critically the university is concerned not to give away risk mitigation proposals. Our view from the Liberal Party is that not enough information has been provided publicly, and the apparent secrecy over so much of it does lead people to have questions over whether all of these things have necessarily been thought through. Through the course of the inquiry, and particularly the in-camera session, I became more confident that many of the things I would have raised had been thought through, are in the risk register, and indeed have risk mitigation strategies. Whether or not I'm fully satisfied that they'll definitely work or not, it is certainly a body of work that is significant and clearly of quality. But we can't tell people what it is. And that's one of the inherent problems to the process. The Greens and the Liberal Party and Frank Pangolo have for some time been calling for more information to be released. I accept, and the Liberal Party accepts certainly, that you can't release everything. There would need to be certain redactions to protect the state's interests in the sorts of areas I've just described. But I think that this process could have been done better with more information released. That said, as I go through Professor Abbott's list of specific risks that he brought to the attention of the committee, some of them I can reflect on, some of them I agree with, some of them I don't share, and sometimes the reason for that is because I'm aware of information the universities have given to the committee that's, for whatever reason, with the support of the government in particular, not able to be shared in the public domain. So be it. So I'm quoting from Professor Abbott. Risk 1, Professor Abbott points out that the Adelaide merger study was done without transparency. Staff were not brought along. The NTU survey showed 25% in favour of the merger. On the ground, those 25% are largely lukewarm. One sees no enthusiasm. The elephant in the room is this: how can one possibly execute a merger as large and complex as this if the staff have not been engaged to a level where they have buy-in and ownership of the process? I agree that that is a risk. It's a subjective question in my mind as to how many of the staff would be on Professor Abbott's side of the question, how many of the staff would be on the government side of the question, and I suspect what the fact is there's a large group in the middle who actually just want to get on and do their jobs. So certainly we go into this in the hope that staff will be brought along much more successfully now that it is a done deal. Risk 2. Professor Abbott says University of Adelaide and UniSA are not well matched. They are different types of university that serve the state differently, as I've described. To merge the two into a one-size-fits-all uni and yet operate at GO8 level will attract fewer students into the state as compared with operating them separately. And he talks about a two-tier system. I'm not sure that I fully agree with this. There's evidence in the committee's report, for example, that suggests that the entrance level for those students using an ATAR to Adelaide Uni and UniSA is actually much more similar than I think is believed to be the case. I think for many domestic students, they will choose a university based on the campus field that fits right, the campus fit that feels most right for them. Geographical choices feed into it. Vibe and culture even inform the student experience. And there's a question mark over how those things will play out in the future with just one university. Certainly for somebody living adjacent to the McGill Uni, being able to walk to uni is no longer an opportunity for them to consider. But I think that some of the assumptions that many people might have about the quality of preparation for students going to the two universities is not necessarily accurate any longer. I reflect on contributions made by members of the Parliamentary Liberal Party to discussions, graduates of the University of South Australia. Their concern was not that the new university would capture all of the quality and the prestige of Adelaide University, their concern was that the student experience, the positive student experience they had and the graduate satisfaction they had at UniSA wouldn't be replicated. The truth is that is a risk too. What we want to see and what we will need to see if we're to see the opportunities fully realised is the best of both universities brought along. And that will require work, but I don't necessarily accept the risk described here. Risk 3 from Professor Abbott. He says, an exodus is inevitable. In a merger as large and as complex as this, resources and time get diverted from core business activities. The top 200 staff who are research intensive are those that can be employed in any university in the world with ease. As soon as merger activities slow down their research progress, there will be a flight risk. And certainly that goes to some of the points I've already been making. If the worst case scenario comes to be the case and a lot of those 200 staff leave, that'll be a big problem for the university. That's a specific issue that was raised with the Vice-Chancellors and which they've addressed, and certainly I take some comfort from the Vice-Chancellor's response to this. We certainly don't want to see those staff leave, so I guess the call is to everybody. If you know a university researcher operating at a top level, then encourage them to stay because our state will need them. The risk needs to be understood there. And I'm not sure the committee report fully accepted it. I'm grateful that the Vice-Chancellors recognised that risk and have duly responded. Risk 4 identified is that staff layoffs and cost overruns are inevitable. In year 4 of the Manchester merger, it became clear that the goals of the merger were off target. The university went £3 million into deficit and laid off 400 staff. Then in year 5 of the merger, £1 billion was injected to ensure its success. And this was a tiny merger where there were only 6,000 students. By contrast, UniSA is over 30,000, so the capacity for cost overrun is much bigger. In relation to costs and future investments, I guess the point I would make, and this does touch on some of the material that was received in camera, but the application of funds that are already in the university's budgets for expenditure in the coming decade, when applied in the new university's context, I don't think it's reasonable to talk about that as cost overrun. I'll give an example. There are 2 health science buildings on North Terrace that have been invested in by the 2 universities over the last decade. They spent $300 million each on these 2 separate buildings. Now, the point has been made that if you had 2 universities working together on one strategic plan, you might have got a better outcome than the 2 separate $300 million buildings with one $500 million building, and you'd have $100 million left over. The 2 universities that we have at the moment have forward budgets with significant investment expectations in relation to infrastructure, in relation to IT, in relation to curriculum design and development that are already in their budgets going forward. The merger would effectively see those quantums brought together and enabled to be invested strategically in the state's interests by one institution. The scale of those sums is significant, let's say. And I don't think would fairly be categorised as a cost overrun when they are expended. Having insight such as we were given in the committee into that expenditure is useful in informing us. It is really unfortunate from my point of view that it's not available to the broader public to understand. I understand why the universities are reluctant to provide it, but I urge the universities and the government to, again, make available as much of the information as is viable, as is possible, to help build community confidence that they're not going to see cost overruns that might see the university coming back to the state asking for further investment. In saying that, the Liberal Party will support the bill, we do so partly in confidence from having understood the business case detail that hasn't been released publicly, that there is unlikely to be that further call on the taxpayer requiring further significant investment. And that would be very unfortunate if it wasn't realised. Risk 5 from Professor Abbott. He says the merger is unprecedented. The Premier has correctly stated that no merger of this type and size has been done before, but this should cause us immediate concern, surely. Add to that the large difference in ranking between the 2 universities, their different ethos, different cultures. What is concerning is that no one knows how to even do a merger like that. Our management has zero experience with that, consultants have zero experience with that, and so forth. The chance of failure will put our state and our universities at risk of reputational damage. That is a risk. There is no comparable merger. Risk 6, irreversibility. Once the egg has been scrambled, you can't put it back in its shell. Therefore, if the merger were to go ahead, it would need more realistic costing and much larger funding to ensure success. Irreversibility, I agree with. Nevertheless, we have the independents, the One Nation and Honourable Connie Benares in the Upper House confirming the merger is going ahead, and I make my comments in that environment. Realistic costing, much larger funding. I think when you take into account the university's own forward budgets, then that's probably less of a risk. Risk 7, the project is highly undercosted, and that I think basically is addressed by the same comments I've just made. Risk 8, the merger business case relies on a further 6,000 international students. What if they don't come? The risk is heightened when you consider the cost of living, housing and rent in Adelaide are sharply rising, while China is undergoing a property market crash right now and its economy is tanking. This change in economic outlook, together with geopolitical tension, means that reliance on extra international students is completely fraught. And to that end, it is a risk. The opportunity provided by the merger assumes that 5,000 to 7,000 international students will come here. That will unlock extra funding that can be applied to research, which will improve rankings, which will bring in extra international students, and so on. The virtuous circle relies on international students coming in, and if they don't come, that is a risk. And I'll get to conversation about addressing that question when we have the opportunity to come back. So with that, I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave is sought. Is leave granted? Leave is granted. Minister